Let's begin with a question that seems almost too obvious to ask. Who are you? Not your name, not your profession, not the roles you play for other people. Strip all of that away. What remains? When you say, what exactly are you pointing to? Most people, if pressed, gesture toward their body. This body here, this physical thing occupying space, that must be me. It feels solid. It feels continuous. You wake up in the same body you went to sleep in. You look in the mirror and recognize the same face. There is a deep assumption that this biological structure is a stable object moving through time. But physics and biology tell a very different story. At the microscopic level, your body is not solid at all. It is made of atoms, and atoms are mostly empty space. A tiny nucleus surrounded by a cloud of probabilities where electrons are likely to be found. If you could zoom in far enough, what you would see is not solidity but structure, dynamic, vibrating structure. Now here is where it becomes strange. The atoms that make up your body are not permanent residents. They come and go. Every breath you take exchanges atoms with the atmosphere. Oxygen molecules enter your lungs, diffuse into your bloodstream, participate in chemical reactions, and leave as carbon dioxide. The carbon in that carbon dioxide may become part of a plant next year. The hydrogen in the water you drink may pass through you in hours. Your skin constantly sheds cells. Your gut lining replaces itself rapidly. Even your skeleton, which feels so rigid and enduring, is continuously remodeled by living cells breaking down and rebuilding bone tissue. Over the course of years, most of the atoms that compose your body are replaced. So pause and consider this carefully. If nearly all the physical matter that composes you changes over time, in what sense are you the same person? If identity were simply the collection of atoms, then you would no longer be the individual who existed 10 years ago. That person's atoms are scattered in the air, in the soil, perhaps inside other living organisms. And yet, you do not feel as though you have vanished and been replaced. There is a powerful sense of continuity. You remember being a child. You remember events from years ago. There is a thread connecting those moments to this one. So perhaps identity is not about the specific material, but about the arrangement of that material. Not the atoms themselves, but the pattern they form. Think of a river. We give it a name and speak of it as though it were a stable object. But the water that flows through it today is not the water that flowed through it yesterday. The molecules are constantly moving on. Still, we call it the same river because the overall pattern, the channel, the flow, the dynamic structure persists. Maybe you are something like that. Not a fixed collection of matter, but a continuously maintained pattern. The atoms flow through you the way water flows through a river. The structure remains recognizable even though the components are replaced. If that is true, then the you that feels so solid may not be a thing at all. It may be a process, an ongoing organization of matter and energy that maintains itself for a while. And that possibility changes the question entirely. If we follow this idea seriously, that you are not the matter, but the pattern, then we have to ask a more precise question. What kind of pattern? When people speak about who they are, they usually don't mean their liver or their femur, they mean their mind. Their thoughts, preferences, memories, habits, fears, talents. The sense of being an inner experiencer behind the eyes. So let's narrow our focus to the brain. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons. Each neuron is a living cell that communicates with others using tiny electrical impulses and chemical signals. These neurons form vast networks, constantly exchanging information. Patterns of activity ripple through these networks every fraction of a second. But here's something subtle and important. A thought is not an object. You cannot pick up a thought. You cannot weigh it. You cannot isolate it in space the way you isolate a pebble. A thought is something that happens. It is an event, a temporary coordination of neural firing. Consider a simple example. Imagine you hear your name spoken. Instantly, certain neurons activate in your auditory cortex to process the sound. Others activate to recognize the pattern as familiar. Still others connect that pattern to your self model, the internal representation of me. All of this unfolds in milliseconds. The experience of hearing your name is the coordinated activity of many regions, none of which contains a little person inside observing the event. There is no central control room in the brain. If you search anatomically for the location of the self, the precise spot where I lives, you won't find it. There is no single neuron or cluster labeled identity. Instead, there are distributed processes interacting in loops. Sensory areas, memory systems, emotional circuits, predictive models, all influencing each other continuously. The feeling of being a unified self emerges from this interaction. Think of a whirlpool forming in a river. The whirlpool looks like a stable thing. You can point to it. You can say, there it is. But the water composing the whirlpool is constantly changing. The structure persists, not because the molecules remain the same, but because the dynamic conditions sustain the pattern. Your mind may work in much the same way. The specific neurons involved in a thought shift from moment to moment. Synapses strengthen or weaken over time, yet the overall organization maintains enough stability that you experience continuity. Now consider memory, which we often treat as the anchor of identity. It feels as though memory is a stored record, like a video file sitting intact in a cabinet. But neuroscience shows something different. When you recall an event, you reconstruct it. The brain reactivates fragments, sensory details, emotional tones, narrative interpretations, and assembles them into a coherent story. Each recall slightly modifies the memory. It is rewritten. So even the narrative you tell yourself about who you are is not fixed. It is actively rebuilt moment by moment. This means your identity is not a static archive. It is a live performance. The brain maintains a model of self because it is useful. It helps predict consequences, coordinate actions, and maintain social relationships. But the model is continuously updated. It is less like a statue carved in stone and more like a software process running on biological hardware. And here is the important shift. If the self is a process generated by interacting systems, then it does not exist as a single, unchanging entity. It exists the way a melody exists, through the structured unfolding of notes over time. Stop the process, and the self vanishes. Keep it running, and the illusion of solidity remains. Now we arrive at a deeper difficulty. Even if we accept that the self is a pattern in the brain, a dynamic process rather than a solid object, there is still something that feels undeniably real. Experience itself. Right now you are having an experience. There is color, sound, bodily sensation, thought. There is a feeling of being located somewhere behind your eyes, looking out at the world. That immediacy seems impossible to dismiss. You might agree that your body changes and your memories are reconstructed, but the fact that I am here aware feels solid. So what is that? Neuroscience gives us partial clues, but not a complete answer. What we know is that the brain constantly integrates information from many sources. Visual signals from the eyes, sounds from the ears, signals from muscles and organs. All of these streams converge and are coordinated. The brain builds a model not only of the external world, but of the body itself inside that world. This internal model includes a representation of position, ownership, and agency. It tracks where your limbs are. It predicts the consequences of your actions. It labels certain movements as mine. Without this model, coordinated behavior would collapse. There are striking experiments that reveal how constructed this sense of self is. In what's known as the rubber hand illusion, a fake hand is placed in front of a participant while their real hand is hidden. Both the fake hand and the real hand are stroked simultaneously. After a short time, many participants begin to feel as if the rubber hand is their own. Their brain integrates visual and tactile signals and updates the body model accordingly. Ownership, it turns out, is negotiable. Other neurological conditions show similar effects. In certain brain injuries, patients deny ownership of a limb. In others, they may feel a presence nearby that is not actually there. These cases suggest that the sense of being a unified self located in a specific body is something the brain actively constructs. Even the feeling of agency, the sense that I chose this action, is more complicated than it seems. Experiments measuring brain activity show that neural signals indicating a decision can appear before a person becomes consciously aware of deciding. This does not eliminate free will in any simple way, but it does suggest that what we experience as a deliberate choice may be the conscious registration of processes already underway. The self, then, may function as a kind of interpreter. The brain performs countless operations outside of awareness. After the fact, a narrative system weaves these operations into a coherent story. I decided, I intended, I felt. That story is extraordinarily convincing. But convincing does not mean fundamental. When you look for the observer inside, the one supposedly watching thoughts, making decisions, owning experiences, you cannot find a separate entity. you find only more processes: sensory integration, memory activation, emotional tagging, prediction and correction. It is processes observing processes. The feeling of being a central, unchanging witness may itself be another pattern, stable enough to feel continuous, but dependent on ongoing activity. If the activity shifts dramatically, as in deep sleep or anesthesia, that sense of self fades or disappears. What remains clear is this: the self does not appear as a single object in the brain. It appears as an emergent property of complex, interacting systems. And emergent properties are real, but they are not separate substances. They are what happens when parts move together in a particular way. The question that lingers is whether the feeling of I is anything more than that coordinated movement. We do not yet have a final answer, but everything we observe points in the same direction. The solidity of identity may be the most convincing pattern your brain creates. Even if we accept that the self is a constructed process, there is still a powerful intuition that something must remain constant. After all, you wake up each morning with the assumption that you are the same person who went to sleep. Society depends on this assumption. Responsibility, memory, relationships, all of these rely on continuity. So let's examine continuity more carefully. Imagine recording your brain state at this exact moment with perfect precision, every neuron, every synaptic strength, every chemical gradient. Now imagine that tomorrow your brain is slightly different. Some synapses have strengthened due to learning, others have weakened. A few neurons have died, others have formed new connections. This is not hypothetical. It is happening constantly. The question is not whether your brain changes. It does. The question is how much change can occur before we say the identity is no longer the same. There is no clear boundary. If you change 0, so will 1%, you are still you. If you change 1%, still you. Over 10 years, perhaps 30% or more of your neural connections have reorganized, still you. But at no point is there a precise line where we can say, now the old self has ended and a new one has begun. Continuity is gradual, not absolute. This leads to a classic philosophical puzzle. Suppose we could create a perfect duplicate of you, atom for atom, neuron for neuron, at this instant. The duplicate with your memories, your personality, your sense of being you. From its perspective, it would genuinely believe it is the original. Which one is you? Physics would treat both systems as equally valid continuations of the prior pattern. There is no physical tag attached to one saying authentic self. Identity, in this case, branches. Our intuition rebels against this idea because we imagine identity as singular and indivisible. But that intuition may be a byproduct of how our brains evolved. In everyday life, duplication at that level does not occur. So the brain never needed to develop an intuition for branching selves. Another way to approach this is to think about time not as a series of snapshots, but as a continuous unfolding. The you of 5 seconds ago is not identical to the you now. Yet there is overlap, shared memory traces, shared structural organization. Identity may be nothing more than overlapping similarity across time. Consider a flame. If you light a candle and watch it burn for an hour, you call it the same flame. But the gases involved in combustion are constantly changing. The exact atoms participating at one moment are gone the next. The flame persists because the conditions sustaining it persist. Now imagine gradually altering the candle, changing the wax composition, adjusting the oxygen supply, modifying the wick. At what exact modification does it become a different flame? There is no sharp answer. Your identity may function in the same way. It persists because the underlying biological and informational processes maintain continuity. When those processes cease, as in deep unconsciousness, or ultimately death, the pattern dissolves. There is no hidden core left behind in the physical description. This is difficult to accept because humans naturally seek stable essences. We prefer clear categories, same person or different person. But nature does not always respect clean boundaries. Clouds blend into sky. Species evolve gradually. Coastlines resist precise measurement. Identity may belong to this category of fuzzy phenomena, real, but not sharply defined. And if that is the case, then asking, is it truly me, may be the wrong kind of question. A better question might be how much structural and informational continuity is preserved. The self, if viewed this way, is not a permanent object traveling through time. It is a continuously updated pattern, maintaining coherence for a while, then eventually dissolving, like every other organized process in the universe. At this point, we've peeled away several layers. The body is not fixed matter, but flowing atoms. The brain is not a static organ, but a dynamic network. The self is not located in a single place, but emerges from distributed processes. Continuity is gradual, not absolute. Now we have to confront the deepest tension of all, the difference between description and experience. Science describes the brain in terms of neurons. Synapses, electrical potentials, chemical gradients. These are measurable quantities. We can observe them, manipulate them, model them mathematically. But none of those descriptions seem to capture what it feels like to be you. There is something it is like to see the color red. Something it is like to feel embarrassment. Something it is like to anticipate the future. That inner texture of experience, often called subjective experience, does not appear directly in the equations. This is sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. We can explain how signals travel from the retina to the visual cortex. We can explain how certain neural circuits correlate with reported experiences. But why should electrical activity feel like anything at all? Here we must be honest, we do not know. Some scientists suspect that consciousness emerges when information is integrated in a sufficiently complex way. Others propose that certain patterns of feedback loops are key. There are mathematical theories attempting to quantify integrated information. There are global workspace models suggesting that when information becomes globally available across brain systems, it enters awareness. All of these approaches attempt to bridge the gap between objective process and subjective experience. But even if we one day fully map the neural correlates of every conscious state, a question may remain: does the description exhaust the phenomenon? When you describe a flame in terms of oxidation reactions and energy transfer, you have explained how it works. But the warmth you feel on your hand is still something you experience directly. The description does not replace the sensation. Similarly, describing the neural mechanisms of identity does not eliminate the lived reality of being a self. It reframes it. Perhaps the mistake is thinking that the self must be either an illusion or a substance. There is a third possibility. It may be a real phenomenon, but real in the way patterns are real. A hurricane is not a solid object. It is a self-organizing system of air and energy. It has structure, boundaries, measurable properties. It can even be given a name. Yet it is made entirely of moving components. No one asks where the core essence of the hurricane is located beyond its physical processes. Its identity is the organized activity itself. If the self is similar, an organized activity of matter and information, then its reality does not depend on being a permanent thing. It depends on the persistence of the process. This perspective changes how we frame the mystery. Instead of asking, where is the soul-like entity inside the machine? We asked, under what conditions does matter organize itself into a system that models itself? The self may be the brain's most sophisticated model, a representation that includes not just the world, but the organism within the world. A feedback loop in which the system represents itself representing. That kind of recursive modeling could generate the feeling of being an observer. But here is the humbling part. Even if this explanation turns out to be correct, we still do not fully understand why the process is accompanied by experience. We know correlations. We can identify necessary conditions. But the final explanatory bridge remains incomplete. So we stand in an unusual position. We have strong evidence that identity is not a fixed substance. We have strong evidence that it depends on dynamic biological processes. We have growing theories about how those processes generate a self-model. And yet, the inner light of experience remains partially mysterious. Your identity may be an illusion, not in the sense that nothing is happening, but in the sense that what is happening is not what it first appears to be. It feels like a solid, enduring entity. Science suggests it is an event. If we gather everything together, the flowing atoms, the shifting neural networks, the reconstructed memories, the absence of a central observer, a picture begins to form. It is not mystical. It is not supernatural. It is simply unfamiliar. The picture is this: what you call I is a continuously updated model generated by the brain, maintained by biological processes, and shaped by interaction with the environment. But now we must ask an even stranger question. Why does the brain build this model at all? From an evolutionary perspective, organisms that could track their own state had an advantage. If a system can distinguish between self and environment, it can protect itself, seek resources, avoid danger. A bacteria moves toward nutrients and away from toxins without needing a concept of self. But as nervous systems became more complex, internal modeling became more detailed. In humans, this modeling reached extraordinary sophistication. The brain not only tracks the body's position and condition, but also constructs a narrative across time. It links past memory to present perception and projected future. It simulates possibilities. It assigns credit and blame. It imagines how others see it. The self-model becomes a central organizing tool. But a model is not the thing itself. A map of a city can be incredibly detailed. Streets, elevations, traffic patterns, yet no one confuses the map with the city. The self-model is the brain's map of the organism. It integrates sensory input memories and prediction into a coherent reference point labeled me. This model feels immediate because it is constantly updated and rarely questioned. When you move your arm, the brain predicts the sensory consequences before they arrive. When the prediction matches the input, the movement feels self-generated. When it does not, as in certain neurological disorders, the sense of ownership can fracture. The stability of identity depends on successful prediction and integration. Now consider sleep. During deep sleep, the narrative self largely disappears. There is no ongoing story about who you are. In dreams, the self-model can become distorted. You may occupy different roles, different bodies, different rules of reality. Upon waking, the familiar structure reassembles quickly, and you say, it was just a dream. But what disappeared and reappeared? The underlying biological processes continued, but the organized pattern that produces the waking identity shifted dramatically. This suggests that identity is not a constant core shining underneath all states. It is a configuration that can loosen, fragment, or temporarily dissolve. Anesthesia provides an even more striking case. Certain chemicals disrupt large-scale neural integration. The result is not a changed self, it is the absence of experience altogether. When the integration resumes, the self returns. This strongly implies that identity depends on ongoing coordinated activity. No activity, no self. And here is the philosophical turning point. If the self is a model, useful, adaptive, but constructed, then many of the boundaries we treat as absolute may be more flexible than we think. The sharp division between me and world is, at minimum, mediated by neural processes. The sense of a continuous, unbroken entity is a product of memory stitching and predictive stability. This does not mean you do not exist. It means that existence is process-based rather than object-based. A wave exists, but it is not a separate substance from the ocean. It is the ocean moving in a particular way. You may be something like that, matter moving in a particular, self-referential way for a while. When viewed through this lens, identity is not a permanent possession. It is an ongoing event. It is maintained moment by billions of interactions you never consciously witness. And perhaps the most astonishing part is this. The universe has arranged itself, at least in this region, into a pattern that not only persists, but wonders what it is. That wondering is part of the pattern too. Now we arrive at a subtle but transformative shift in perspective. If identity is not a fixed object, but an ongoing process, then the way we think about change must also change. We tend to imagine ourselves as stable entities that undergo experiences. But what if we are not entities that experience change? What if we are the change? Consider a simple physical system, a standing wave on a string. When you pluck a string at just the right frequency, a stable pattern appears. It looks stationary, almost frozen in place. But it is not static at all. Energy is continuously moving through the string. The pattern persists only because motion persists. If the motion stops, the pattern vanishes instantly. The wave is not something added to the string. It is what the string is doing under certain conditions. Now extend that analogy carefully. Your body is a biochemical system sustained by metabolism, constant energy flow. Your brain is an electrochemical network sustained by that metabolism. Thoughts, perceptions, emotions, these are dynamic patterns of activity within that network. You are not a passenger inside the system. You are the system in motion. This reframing removes the need for a hidden inner controller. There is no extra substance required beyond the organized activity. Just as the wave does not need a separate wave essence beyond the vibrating string, the self may not require a separate metaphysical core beyond the interacting processes of the brain and body. But here's where it becomes philosophically rich. If you are a process, then your boundaries are less absolute than they appear. A process is defined by interactions. The flame depends on oxygen. The whirlpool depends on the surrounding water. A living organism depends on its environment at every level: air, temperature, nutrients, social interaction. Your brain develops in response to language, culture, relationships. The structure of your self-model is shaped by other people's feedback. Even your sense of personality is partly sculpted by social context. So where exactly do you and the world begin? At the surface of the skin. That boundary works biologically, but informationally it is porous. The words you are reading right now are altering neural connections inside your brain. External symbols are becoming internal structure. The process, that is you, includes constant exchange with what you call not you. From a thermodynamic perspective, living systems are far from equilibrium structures. They maintain order by exchanging energy and matter with their surroundings. Cut off that exchange, and the structure collapses. The self as a living pattern exists only through openness. This challenges the intuitive picture of a sealed, independent identity. Instead, it suggests something relational. The self is not merely located in a body, it is enacted through interaction. Even psychologically, identity shifts depending on context. You are not exactly the same person with a close friend as you are in a formal interview. Different traits activate. Different neural circuits dominate. Yet you call all of these expressions me. Perhaps identity is not a single unified structure, but a family of overlapping patterns stabilized by memory and narrative coherence. The brain prefers coherence. It smooths contradictions. It edits inconsistencies. It maintains the illusion of a single author behind all actions. But closer inspection reveals modular systems negotiating with one another, emotional drives, rational planning, habit circuits, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. The I may be the name we give to the temporary alignment of these subsystems. And when that alignment shifts, the sense of self shifts with it. This does not reduce you to nothing. It reveals you as something more dynamic than you imagined, a continuously negotiated, self-organizing pattern embedded in a larger web of processes. Not a static noun, but a verb. If we continue this line of thinking all the way down, something remarkable happens to our picture of reality. We began with the intuition that identity is solid, a stable core that persists unchanged while the world flows around it. But science, layer by layer, replaces solidity with structure and structure with activity. At the most fundamental level, we currently understand matter itself is not made of tiny, hard objects. Modern physics describes a world of fields, continuous entities that exist throughout space. What we call particles are localized excitations of these fields, small ripples in something deeper. An electron is not a miniature marble. It is a stable vibration of an underlying electron field. A proton is a dynamic configuration of quarks and gluons interacting within quantum fields. Even the atoms that compose your brain are mostly empty space structured by forces and probabilities. So when we say your identity is a pattern in matter, we're already speaking about patterns in patterns. The neurons in your brain are arrangements of molecules. Those molecules are arrangements of atoms. Those atoms are arrangements of subatomic excitations. At every level, what appears solid dissolves into organized activity. There is no final self-particle hiding at the bottom. This does not mean reality is unreal. It means reality is relational and dynamic. Now step back and look at the larger arc. For billions of years, the universe evolved increasing complexity. Simple particles formed atoms. Atoms formed stars. Stars forged heavier elements. Planets formed. Chemistry grew more intricate. Eventually, self-replicating molecules emerged. From them, biological evolution sculpted nervous systems. And from certain nervous systems arose the capacity for self-modeling, the ability of matter to represent itself. Your identity is part of that cosmic trajectory. The sense of I is not separate from physics. It is physics arranged in a particular recursive loop, matter modeling matter. And here is the final shift in perspective. If you are a process rather than a thing, then permanence was never part of the deal. The processes arise when conditions allow, and they fade when those conditions change. A storm forms under certain atmospheric dynamics and dissolves when the energy gradients equalize. A living organism persists while metabolism continues and ceases when it cannot. Identity as a high-level biological process follows the same rule. This is not a statement of despair. It is a statement of structure. You do not possess identity the way you possess an object. Identity is the ongoing coordination of countless events, neural firings, hormonal signals, sensory integrations, memory reconstructions. When those events are sufficiently integrated, the feeling of being someone appears. When integration weakens, as in deep sleep or anesthesia, that feeling dims. When integration permanently stops, the pattern no longer exists. Seen this way, the self is neither an illusion in the sense of being fake, nor an eternal substance in the sense of being indestructible. It is a temporary coherence, a region of the universe where matter has become organized enough to say, I. And perhaps the most profound consequence of this view is not about loss, but about connection. If you are a process emerging from the same physical laws that govern stars and galaxies, then the boundary between and the cosmos is thinner than it appears. The atoms in your body were forged in ancient stellar cores. The energy driving your thoughts ultimately comes from nuclear reactions in the sun. The laws shaping your brain are the same laws shaping distant galaxies. You are not an isolated object dropped into a foreign universe. You are a local event within a continuous physical reality, a pattern that briefly becomes aware of the larger pattern it belongs to. When you see identity this way, reality stops looking like a collection of separate, solid things. It begins to look like an unfolding network of processes intersecting, transforming, dissolving, forming, and in that network, what you call you is one of the most intricate patterns we know, not fixed, not independent, not permanent, but undeniably happening. Now let's confront the psychological resistance that naturally arises when we hear all of this. Even if the arguments make intellectual sense, something in you pushes back. It says, fine, maybe I'm made of processes. Maybe my brain constructs a model. But I still feel like a single, continuous subject. That feeling must count for something. And it absolutely does. The key is to understand what kind of thing that feeling is. When you watch a movie, you experience smooth, continuous motion. But the film is composed of discrete frames shown in rapid succession. Your visual system integrates them, fills in gaps, predicts movement, and generates the experience of continuity. The smoothness is not a deception in the sense of being false. It is a construction based on real input. Similarly, your sense of being a single, continuous self may be the brain's integration of countless micro events into a coherent macro experience. At any given moment, billions of neural events are occurring in parallel. Sensory processing, memory retrieval, emotional evaluation, motor planning, all at once. Yet your conscious awareness presents a relatively unified scene. Thoughts appear in sequence. The world appears stable. The I feels singular. This unity is an achievement. It requires synchronization across distributed brain networks. Research suggests that certain large-scale patterns of neural coordination are associated with conscious awareness. When these patterns break down due to injury drugs or neurological disorders, the unity of the self can fragment. There are documented cases in which damage to specific brain regions alters personality dramatically. After certain injuries, individuals may become impulsive, emotionally flat, or socially inappropriate in ways that were previously uncharacteristic. The underlying biological pattern shifts, and the experienced identity shifts with it. This is uncomfortable evidence. It suggests that what we call character, temperament, even moral disposition, depends on fragile neural arrangements. Change the arrangement enough, and the self changes. Split brain research provides another striking example. When the connection between the two hemispheres of the brain is severed to treat severe epilepsy, something astonishing can occur. The two hemispheres can operate semi-independently, sometimes producing conflicting responses. In controlled experiments, one hemisphere may initiate an action, while the speaking hemisphere invents a plausible explanation for it afterward. The narrative self explains behavior it did not initiate. This hints at something profound. The I that tells the story may not be the true originator of all actions. It may be a post hoc interpreter, weaving coherence from distributed activity. Again, this does not mean you are unreal. It means that the self is layered. There is the biological layer of neural processing. There is the integrative layer that coordinates perception and action. And there is the narrative layer that constructs a continuous autobiographical identity. Most of the time, these layers align closely enough that we experience them as one. But alignment is not identity. The stability of the self depends on the stability of these layers working together. When they fall out of sync, identity can feel altered, fragmented, or even absent. This reveals something essential. The self is not a fundamental particle of reality. It is an emergent organization. Its unity is maintained, not given. And perhaps the reason we struggle to accept this is that evolution optimized us for survival, not metaphysical accuracy. A stable sense of self helps coordinate action, assign responsibility, and maintain social bonds. It does not need to reflect ultimate ontological structure. The brain produces a simplified interface, a manageable representation. It feels like a solid center, but under examination it is a dynamic negotiation among processes. The illusion is not that nothing is there. The illusion is that what is there is simpler and more permanent than it truly is.